The Forest. Remember that game? Well, we streamed it on our Twitch last week, so what the heck? Go over to our Twitch, give us a follow, link in the description, and if you're one of those people who clicked on the video without knowing what The Forest is, quite frankly, I'm not sure why. Maybe you saw the phrasing "the forest died" and thought, how could that be? Mr. Beast planted 20 million trees. I'm not talking about that forest, you fucking moron. I'm talking about the game, released by End Night Games in May 2014. I remember 2014. I was 18 years old and only a few pizza sticks away from graduating high school. I also look like this, and quite understandably, I fucking hated myself. Back in 2014 is also when I started getting into watching Twitch streamers. I had only a shitty Toshiba laptop to get me by, which means that Twitch streamers allowed me to live vicariously and feel like I was playing games my laptop could only dream of touching. I was so stupidly obsessed with the game that I spent all of my high school graduation money on a desktop just so I could play it. Well, sorry past Zach, hate to break it to you, but the desktop didn't work either. It wasn't until 6 years later, in 2020, when I was able to boot up the game and run it in all of its ultra settings glory. But during our live stream of the game last week, I realized something. The forest is dead. And no, time did not kill it, as it sometimes does to video games. No, End Night Games, the Forest's own developer, killed it. Let me explain. You see, back in 2014, the core gameplay of The Forest was so simple, yet so effective. You chop down trees, build a camp, and smack bad guys upside the head. Repeat until you either die or make the cannibal society your bitch. There was a lot more to it, of course, but the build, survive loop was always at the core of its gameplay. But Zach, you said it was a survival horror. Yeah, numbnuts. Did I mention that while you're playing the entire time, enemies are adapting to your behaviors, stalking you to catch you off guard and eat your fucking ankles? How about how when you reach 0 health, instead of dying the first time around, they drag you off to their cave and you have to escape with nothing but a fucking Bic lighter? The caves served a crucial dichotomous purpose. On one hand, they added a fear factor to death. And on the other, they acted as a risk versus reward element for the mid and end game. Back in 2014, the forest really was terrifying, and that's why people loved it. But now all of that is gone. The tension that came from trying to survive an adapting set of enemies no longer exists because the enemies are fucking brain dead. Instead of lurking, learning, and adapting, they just fucking chase you like morons. Waves and waves of these same enemies without any variation. End Night did this because as the game was updated, the core gameplay loop was changed. It went from build, survive to build, discover, progress. You see, the forest has a story now. Well, it's always had a, overarching story. Now it had a story that you could actually play and experience, and by God, the developers wanted to make sure you experienced it. And that is why they did two things. First, like I already mentioned, they dumbed down the enemy encounters. Stupefying the enemies means you don't have to invest as much in your building, and there's not as much of a need to hunker down and fight defensively. It also makes surviving much, much easier, and in turn, much more boring. So now that you're thriving with a shelter that you built in 5 minutes, and you're sick of fighting enemies that don't really offer any challenge to you, what left is there to do but explore? The developers added a myriad of points of interest across the map that each serve one of two purposes. One, it gives you an item needed to progress the story, like the rebreather or key card. Or two, it gives you a hint of where that story progression is, like a picture of a cave. They even implemented this loop into the cave itself. Instead of the cave being that risk versus reward element, the cave is now the sole vessel for the story. You're going to run in and out of the cave over and over again as you go deeper and deeper into the story. In doing all of this, the developers tried and failed to implement a system that I call Chekhov's progression. So imagine you're playing a game, and at the end of the hallway is a door. Next to the door is a bunch of ammo, health, armor. The first thought that's going to come to your mind is probably, well, shit, there's probably a boss fight on the other side of the door. Well, guess what? That is a rudimentary example of a level designer throwing a Chekhov's gun right in your face. Chekhov's gun is a principle in storytelling and film that states that any element that you incorporate into your story must come into play later on. So, like in The Quiet Place, it's established very early on in the story that the father is dedicating a lot of resources to trying to fix the deaf daughter's hearing aid. Well, at the end of the movie, we find out the hearing aid is the Achilles heel to defeating the otherwise invulnerable monsters. It is the key to the protagonists being victorious. That's a Chekhov's gun. So remember when I said The Forest was made by a bunch of people in the film industry? Well, they took Chekhov's gun and warped it from being a storytelling mechanic to being an entire progression system. That's why I call it Chekhov's progression. The game has a laundry list of items that you need to get in order to progress through the story, but it doesn't tell you where or how to get them. Instead, it expects you to organically come across them while exploring. Doesn't sound that terrible, right? Well, here's the kicker. And if you're a developer, listen close because this is fucking important. You can't put a laundry list in your game if the players can't fucking read it. The player has no way of knowing he needs the rebreather to complete the story until he reaches that tunnel where he either uses the rebreather or fucking drowns. He doesn't know he needs the key card to enter the laboratory until he's already spent 5 hours exploring the cave and comes across the locked door. So he has to backtrack all the way through all of his progress to find that stupid card he didn't know existed. Remember, The Forest is a survival game. It presents itself as an experience where you need to build shelter, find food, and defend yourself. In a survival scenario, my first instinct isn't to find a fucking key card, it's to put a roof over my head. And yet the survival mechanics are so dumbed down that there's nothing fun to do after the first hour if you don't try going after the story. In film, Chekhov's gun works because there is a script. The audience and the main characters have no choice but to encounter the Chekhov's gun. In a sandbox game like The Forest, the player has too much agency for it to work like that. Instead, what ends up happening is you backtrack hours and hours over and over because, you didn't know there were air canisters on the yacht. You didn't get the climbing axe from cave number 53. I get what they were trying to do, alright? I get it. It doesn't work. It's stupid. When you create a style of progression that relies on backtracking, you end up giving your progression a zigzag shape. Look at this. See what I mean? The shape of Chekhov's progression is a zigzag. It forces you to go back and forth, ping-ponging from location to location like a fucking hamster. Zigzags are directionless, and as a style of progression, they don't work. Compare that to, for example, The Witness. That's another sandbox game where it's up to the player to decide where they go and what milestones they complete first. It's another game with a virtual checklist of things you need to do before you can reach the climax of the game's story. But here's the difference between The Forest and The Witness. While The Forest is a zigzag, The Witness is stoked like the wheel of a bicycle. Look at the maps. In The Witness, there is purpose and conclusion to every direction you take, and no matter where you go, you know you will always end up back in the center, like the spokes of a wheel. In The Forest, well, good fucking luck, my dude, because cave number 5 and cave number 42 look exactly the same to me, and the plane spawns in a random spot every time you start the game, so I have no idea where the fuck I should go. Or you know what, maybe you don't like The Witness. How about Red Dead Redemption 2? That's a huge sandbox with near limitless ways for the player to explore it at almost any time, and yet, the main story progresses naturally in a way that makes complete and total sense. You know why? Because Red Dead 2 is linear. The story follows a single path with hotspots that make things like side quests, collectibles, and everything else feel organic, and yet accessible. So over the course of the game, you end up exploring pretty much the entirety of the map, and yet it all makes sense. you never get lost. A zigzag pattern like the Chekhov's progression used in the forest loses all tension. Instead of being a thrilling survival game with a mysterious story, the game becomes laborious. It becomes a chore. Instead of having fun exploring the treacherous caves and fighting monsters like you used to, you're alt-tabbed reading the fucking wiki because you have no idea where the rebreather is, and the game just introduced a mandatory underwater tunnel so you have to backtrack an hour just to find it. This is why The Forest died. The developers killed it with absolutely terrible progression. Its core gameplay loop is contradictory to its selling point. Instead of immersing the player in a mysterious survival game riddled with terrifying mutants, The Forest is a backtracking chore littered with dumb, face value enemies. Today, the game's really only fun in its first hour, when you crash land on the game with nothing and only one objective: survive. The instant you explore beyond that, all tension is lost. In a weird way, my personal journey with The Forest is almost like a Chekhov's gun, preparing me for what playing The Forest is actually like. No matter how far I thought I was getting to achieving my goal, I kept having to backtrack. I kept having setbacks. It took me 6 years to finally play The Forest the way I wanted to back in 2014. Only Chekhov knows if I'll pick it up again back in 2026. If you made it this far into the video, just wanted to thank you. I know this isn't as entertaining as our past videos, but I thought it was an important and interesting topic. I've never heard someone talk about Chekhov's progression again, and I'd love to see other games that incorporate it, hopefully more successfully than The Forest does. If you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep making things like this, and leave a like and comment with what we should do next. Thanks, guys.